Hi, I want to welcome you and thank you for streaming this message today. I'm really glad that you joined us. At Bailey Christian Church, it matters to us that you feel welcomed, like that this is family. Whether you're young or not so young, my hope is that you'll encounter Jesus, and that as you encounter Jesus, you'll find encouragement to live a life of faith for Him. If you're new with us today, I would love if you wouldn't mind filling out the Connect card that is linked here, or going to baileychristianchurch.com and letting us know who you are, if you have any questions that we can follow up with, or even if you have a prayer concern and you'd like somebody to pray for you, we'd love to know so that we can connect with you. If you're in the area sometime, in the Bailey area, we'd love to have you join us in person. And the reason I invite you into that is because we're called not just to experience a message, but actually to live a life of faith in the context of community. And so we'd love for you to be a part of what's happening here at Bailey. And if you want to know more about how you can get plugged in to what's happening here, again, go back to baileychristianchurch.com, check things out, and if we can help you, we would love to follow up with you as well. I hope today that you're blessed through this message.
One of the things that is true of studying the Bible too is sometimes it's hard, and it's not uncommon to have people say, well, all you just need to do is just read the Bible, the English Bible, and not realize that there's culture, there's language, there are things that are happening geographically that actually it's not just reading the Bible, it's reading things that are surrounding that time that are helpful. For example, for a number of years, critical scholars have viewed the Exodus from Egypt as kind of a myth. You know, either it was something, maybe there was a little nugget of truth, but it was kind of developed and expanded on many, many years later to give Israel a cool story to tell. And this was often said because archaeologists, like in the 1800s, there was a lot of stuff they didn't see. They hadn't discovered, and so they assumed, well, there really is no evidence for this kind of Exodus. Or the other thing is they just assume God, there isn't really a God, and if there's a God, He doesn't do miracles, and so this is just kind of kid storytelling. However, archaeology in the last 50 to 100 years is starting to pull back the curtain a bit, and we're seeing some things that actually start to support more and more something really took place. For example, you would assume that if Israel was in bondage in Egypt, there'd be some evidence of the people of Israel in Egypt, and then at some point later, evidence of the people of God in Canaan, shortly after that. Well, the deeper we dig into it, the more that is what we find, that there are Semitic peoples. Israel was a Semitic people. There were other groups that were from a Semitic people that were not necessarily Israelites, but Israel was from that Semitic bunch. And here's what we find. We find that there are examples of Semitic peoples in Egypt in the time right around what we would think of as the Exodus. In fact, what we found is in a tomb of one of the officials, it shows foreign slaves, some who are Semitic, who are making mud bricks. And if you've read the story maybe in the last week, you know that was part of their story. And it shows that they no longer had any straw for mud brick making, but they were still told to make a quota, and they were beaten because they didn't. Go, that sounds an awful lot like the story we find in Scripture. Now, here's the other thing, by the way. One of the reasons you don't see in Egyptian history, in their storytelling of some of the things that we would see, we would hope to see, is because if you're Egyptian and you're the leading world power at the time, and you lose all of your slave labor and you lose a good portion of your army, You probably don't celebrate that in your great master art and history telling. You try to kind of wash that. That's embarrassing, and so you wash that under the rug. But there are other ways that we have found some things. There's evidence of Egyptians remembering the plagues in what's known as the Ippur Papyrus. There are details given about a river being turned to blood and about great darkness and pestilence, crops being destroyed, the gods that are against Egypt for not obeying, and even about gold being given to these slaves. What's interesting is the leading expert in this particular papyrus says, well, there's a fascinating similarity between that and the biblical story, but it couldn't be historical. It couldn't really actually be there. But here's another thing that's interesting. In a 14th century Egyptian temple, and some think this might have been towards the end of the wandering period, the 40 years of wandering for Israel, there's a reference in this temple to various nomadic groups. Nomads are people who don't have a city. They're wandering. They're shepherds. And there's reference to the nomads who serve the god Baal, which is another god of that day, or a localized god, or the nomads who serve the people or the god of Anak. But there's a reference here to the land of the nomads of Yahweh. Now, what's interesting is that the name Yahweh shows up there. And it might at least appears initially that this is reference to they live to the east in this place toward Canaan where they are still wandering. Now, again, putting all those details together takes time and takes a lot of expertise. But I just want to let you know that when somebody says, that's just a bunch of hooey, that more and more in archaeology, there's some things we haven't found. And we might expect, because we're talking 3,500 years, that there are probably some things we wouldn't find. That makes a lot of sense. I just want you to know that archaeologists are finding some things that continue to support that as well. So, with all that as a backdrop, let's get to our passage this morning. We're going to be in chapter 14. And what's led up to this already, Moses has been called. He's gone to the people of God. He said, I'm going to deliver you. He's confronted Pharaoh. And Pharaoh doesn't want his people to go, doesn't want he loses slave labor. And God brings 10 plagues on the people of Egypt. Now, in part, he's bringing them for judgment because they have treated God's people so poorly. They were killing the baby boys. They were enslaving them as well. And so finally, after that last plague, the plague of the firstborn, where God and the angel of death kind of washes over Egypt and takes the firstborn male of every household and even the firstborn of the cattle. But in Goshen, in the land where God's people were living, where the blood of the lamb was spread over the doorpost of the homes, the death angel passed over. And that story becomes woven into all of God's people's story from then on. That the God of all creation delivered his people from the greatest power of the day. And so not only that, but before they leave, Moses instructs the people of God, before we leave, ask your neighbors if they'll give you stuff. And so they give them gold, jewelry, and silver. And so it says they plundered Egypt. So what's amazing is here's a group of slaves that are powerless, and God comes in power. And the Egyptians finally say, please leave, go. And not only that, why don't you take all of our wealth with you? And so God not only judges Egypt, but he just plunders them. And so with that being said, let's go to chapter 14. Exodus 14, beginning verse 1. And then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal-Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And so the Israelites did this. So Israel looks cornered. They're hemmed in, and God is going to use this as a way of drawing the enemy out into a confrontation. But what's interesting here is this, and you'll see this if you read through the rest of Exodus, is it talking about God hardening Pharaoh's heart. What's that all about? In other words, if God is hardening Pharaoh's heart, and what's happening is because God is making it happen, then why is Pharaoh to blame? Why is it his fault? If God's at work, why do we blame Pharaoh for all this stuff? Well, you have to understand, there are other passages in the book of Exodus that talk about Pharaoh hardening his own heart. So what's happening is this, that God doesn't do something inside of Pharaoh that Pharaoh doesn't already want. In other words, Pharaoh's heart is already leaning in this direction. Pharaoh is already saying, I'm in charge. I don't know anything about this God. I don't care. I want to keep these people enslaved. So he's taking Pharaoh where he's already headed, not contrary to his heart. In fact, as one scholar put it, he strengthened him in this resolve. So Pharaoh is already going in this direction to abuse God's people, and God says, well, let me help you the rest of the way. And I'm going to use your actions to bring glory to myself. In fact, I want you to put that in the back of your mind. The glory of God is going to be key. Over and over again in this passage, you're going to be seeing that God is going to use this circumstance in order to give glory to himself. Look at verse 5. Now, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them. And they said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go, and we have lost their services. So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them at the camp as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. This is indication of this is a large army that's coming against the people of God. And what we do know is that Egypt is known for their chariots, and they also had a special emphasis on archers. They had some very well-trained archers who rode in these chariots. So these archers could actually shoot on the move. What made them effective was not only could they shoot at targets on the move, but because they were moving, they were a little harder to hit themselves, and so they were a force to be dealt with. And so they're bringing it all towards this battle on the people of God. Verse 10, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? One of the things that marks the people of God in the book of Exodus and in Numbers as well is they whined a lot. They were complainers. In fact, they're used as an example of saying, do not complain like the people in the people of God in the wilderness and being delivered. On the other hand, can you blame them? I mean, they've been in bondage for 400 years. They don't know anything other than slavery. And not only that, this message is sarcastic. And the sarcasm is this, that Egypt they were like experts in graves. 3/4 of their land was set aside as grave sites. So the sarcasm is, you mean there wasn't enough places to bury us in Egypt? You got to bring us out into the wilderness to do this? And so they're frustrated, they're scared, and they go on to say, what have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. You see, not only does Egypt think Israel is cornered, so does Israel. They're scared. In fact, I think that's what makes trials a challenge at times, because even though God may be playing out something very significant, from our perspective, we go, what are you thinking, God? I mean, why? I mean, this looks awful. This looks like there's no hope at all. In fact, I mean, that's a good question. Why does God do it this way? Well, the first one he's already mentioned. Because it draws Pharaoh out. Pharaoh thinks they're cornered, and he goes, aha, I've got some easy prey. I can attack them and take over them. But the other is even more important. To prove to Egypt and to Israel and to all the nations that he's the one true God. that God is the God who delivered his people from an impossible situation. That's the one true God. But I want to highlight another thing, and I want to go back to this issue of them, and you'll see this throughout Exodus. Can we just go back to Egypt? I mean, at least there we got 3 squares. I mean, we could eat regularly. We had food. We were slaves, but, at least we knew what to expect. Well, that's typical of people who've been in bondage. In fact, I want to share a story with you. Before walking out of jail, a free man in February of 2016, Albert Woodfox spent 43 years almost without pause in isolation, in an isolation cell. He became the longest standing solitary confinement prisoner in America. He had no view of the sky from inside his 6-foot by 9-foot concrete box, no human contact. And taking a walk meant pacing from one end of the cell to the other and then back again. But then in April 2016, he found himself now on a beach in Galveston, Texas, in the company of a friend. And he stood there just kind of marveling at the beachgoers as they came and went and under cloudless sky. And he stared out over the Gulf of Mexico as it was stretched far into the horizon. He said, you could hear the tide and the water coming in. It was so strange walking on the beach and all these people and kids running around. Can you imagine that after living in a 6x9 room? But of all the terrifying details of Woodfox's 4 decades of solitary confinement, perhaps the most chilling aspect of all is what he says 2 months later. 2 months after the state of Louisiana sets him free on his 69th birthday, he says he sometimes wishes he was back in that cell. He said, oh yeah. Human beings feel more comfortable in areas that they are secure. And in a cell, you have a routine. You pretty much know what is going to happen, when it's going to happen. But in society, it's difficult. It's looser. So there are moments when, I wish I was back in the security of a cell. I mean, it does that to you. Have you ever watched maybe a person you really care about return again and again to an abusive relationship? And you find yourself pulling your hair out and going, why are they doing that? Or to somebody who wrestles with an addiction and they can never quite be free of it. Now, there's a lot of, there's physical and there's chemical stuff. There's literal addictive parts that change in our system. So there's parts of that we understand scientifically. But from this side, we take a look and we go, why would you do that to yourself? And I think it's not unlike what the people of God are doing when they're being set free from Egypt. I'm more comfortable with the familiar bondage that I'm in and slavery than I am with the uncertainty of the freedom that lies ahead. And so I'm going to keep going back to that because I might be miserable, but at least it's a misery I already know. The promise that God is walking his people through is to say, I know you don't know what the promised land looks like, but trust me, it's so much better than that little 9x6 cell that you live in. There is hope. And so the message of the Exodus is a message for our day too, is that there's hope. There's something beyond this confinement that you're so used to. There's something better. Let's continue on, verse 13. In fact, verses 13 and 14 will be core and key to our reflection a little bit later. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. And we'll come back to that. Verse 15. But then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. God turns to Moses and he says, would you guys quit your belly aching and get going? Now, I mean, what Moses just got done saying is beautiful, and it's exactly what the people of God needed to know. But somehow, even Moses is being distracted, or he's being delayed, and God is saying, "No, let's get at it. Let's get going." Verse 19. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other. So neither went near the other all night long. And what a powerful image of God's protection. Going out now behind, but really kind of in front of the Egyptians. And as one writer said, what a powerful image of the blessing of God in light and of the judgment of God in darkness all at the same time. That what is serving as God's deliverance of his people will also be judgment on Egypt. Another aspect of this that's interesting throughout the Old Testament, but especially in Exodus, is that you'll see sometimes the presence of God is referenced as the angel of God is going before. And in this case, you have the image of the cloud, the pillar of a cloud, or the pillar of fire. Cloud and fire are powerful images in the Old Testament of the very presence of God. And other times it just says, and God went with them or before them. So it just kind of bypasses that and talks about the presence of God. Either way, what is clear in this passage is that just as God promised to Moses at the burning bush, he's doing it now. I'll be with you. I'll see you through this. Verse 21. And then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind, and he turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. And then the Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and the cloud at the Egyptian army and threw them into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Two things kind of stand out to me in this passage. One is it talks about God looking down from the pillar of cloud and fire and seeing what the Egyptians were doing. Now, what's interesting is God really up here and people are down here? Isn't God everywhere? Does God really have to look down? The language there is descriptive. And it's used also in Genesis, in Genesis 11, the story of the Tower of Babel, where these people gather together and they say, we're going to make a name for ourselves, and so we're going to build a temple up to the heavens, and we'll be something. And then it says, and God looked down on what they were doing. In other words, God was already above them. And he looks down and he confuses their language. This is a powerful image in the reading to say that here are the powers of earth, but God is above them. And he looks down and he sees what they're doing, and he then acts. In fact, what's amazing is that as he acts and as the chariot wheels fall off and all this kind of thing, we hear the acknowledgement of God's involvement. But who are the lips from which we hear that? The Egyptian army. So, well, let's get out of here because their God is fighting against Egypt. And so already what God has said is starting to happen. And the praises of the glory of God will be on the lips of the Egyptians. Verse 26. And then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and their horsemen. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. And the water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on the right and a wall of water on their left. And that day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. What a powerful image to these slaves. That these who they had feared, these slave masters, were wiped out like that by God. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they put their trust in him and in Moses, their servant. Two things happen as a result of this experience. I mean, there's multiple things, but two in particular here that this is noted at the end. When the people of God saw this, it put the fear of God in them. They were afraid. I mean, they realized there really is a God, and he's it. But the second thing that came out of that is that they put their trust in Moses as their leader. That God used this to anchor them, to show that he's a deliverer and that he's powerful to save, but also to bolster, in this case, Moses as the one that they're to look to. And now, as you read through the rest of the story, you realize that ebbs and flows. There are times where they don't fear God like they need to, and they don't respect Moses as they need to. But for this moment, they're trusting God and trusting Moses. So what I want to do, I want to look back at verse 13 and 14, and because I think there's some things that we can learn there. You know, the challenge of reading the Old Testament or the Bible is, well, that was a neat story, but what difference does it make? And so I think part of our challenge as Bible students is to take a look at the story and say, how does that apply to today? And so this morning I want to take a look at 5 things in particular that to keep in mind as you and I are facing our own enemies, as you and I face spiritual battles ourselves, that Moses passes on to the people of God as they're facing the Egyptian army. And the first one is this: fright. He identifies fright. That is, and he identifies it by saying, do not be afraid. And the reality is that fear is a common response for all of us. I mean, who doesn't get afraid? And who wouldn't have been afraid with the most powerful army of the day coming against you? That makes sense. I suspect that many of you can remember 2020, the kind of year that we had there. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of frustration. And one of there are multiple Bible apps online, but one of the Bible apps mentioned, as they took kind of a look at their statistics, the number one verse that was looked up, in this case in India, in the Netherlands, and in America. And it was a verse from Isaiah that says, do not fear, do not be afraid. In Ghana, the number one verse was a verse from Philippians that says, do not be anxious in anything. And so we realize that as the world, even today, as we face challenges and scary things, our first inclination is to be afraid. We need reassurance. And so God, through Moses, is reassuring his people, don't be afraid. Now, let me just say something here. Sometimes people will say, well, is he saying, how dare you be afraid? As if it's kind of a shaming thing. You shouldn't be afraid. That's not what he's saying. In fact, this is often the set of words that is used when an angel appears. Guess what people do when an angel appears? They're terrified, and rightly so. Never had that experience. So what happens when God shows up and when the army shows up? The initial reaction is fear, and that's not a wrong reaction. It makes sense, because if something doesn't happen, we're going to die. But what Moses is telling them is this, as Terence Fredheim says, is that your worst fears will not be realized. Yeah, I understand you're afraid. I just want you to know that in the end, what you're afraid of, it ain't going to happen. Not today. And so what God is saying is that God is bigger than our fears. And so fright's going to come. We're going to be afraid at times, but we don't need to live in fear. Number 2 is flight. So he talks about fright, and then he talks about flight. In fact, that's his words kind of respond to that. Stand firm. And what is the tendency when we face an enemy that is so big? Our tendency is to want to flee from the battle. We want to hide. I want to go anywhere but here. I kind of want to live today. But God tells his people to hold their ground. Stand firm. Now, I want to highlight something. That doesn't mean that Christians persecution is coming, must always stay right there. Paul didn't stay in the city when people wanted to stone him. And there were times where Jesus made his way through a crowd because today wasn't the day he was going to die. So there are times in which God's people are called, they don't have to literally stand in one place and not move. But the heart of it is this: I want you to stand firm and not move in fear, because I've got this, is what God is saying. In fact, that leads to the third word, and that's sight. So he talks about fright. Don't be afraid. Flight, he says, stand firm, because I know you want to run from this. But the third one is sight. He says, you will see. You are going to see God show up. Now, I want you to understand this word sight and see is an important word in this passage. Take a look at your insert. So just as God looks down on Egypt from the pillar, and just as Egypt will come to see that Yahweh is truly God, because he tells them they're going to see who is God, Israel will see for themselves that God is almighty. And so what is happening here is this is a faith-developing experience for Israel. They get to see firsthand the goodness and the power of God. And the reason I want to highlight that is because I understand that most of us don't get all that excited about a battle or a struggle coming our way. Because who likes that? I mean, who likes to live in tension? Who likes to live in uncertainty? Most of us don't say, God, you know what? I've been having it really good. Could you just bring it on? That's not how we typically wake up in our mornings. And yet, my guess is if you would walk back your spiritual story and there was a time of intense trial or challenge, my guess is that for most of us we'd say, and that's when I felt closest to God. That's when God showed up in a way that had that not happened, I would never have experienced this aspect of God. Now, I understand some of you will say, well, actually, when I was going through trials, I felt very far from God because God didn't seem to show up the way I wanted him to. I get that too. But I believe even in those instances, God is desiring to use that for us to find him in ways we would not find him, even to understand that God is present when we don't always feel he's present. And so in those experiences, we get to see the deliverance of God ourselves. But that's not the only thing. Take a look at your insert. I think that God is also reminding us who to look at or whom to look at in the midst of a spiritual battle. Not the enemy, but God. Do you ever take your child to get a shot or to have something significant that happens, or even to dive off the diving board? There's all this going around and there's noise, and so you just look at me, keep looking at me, stay focused. Makes me think of David when David walks to the battlefield and he sees Goliath, the giant. David doesn't see a giant to be feared. He sees an enemy to be dealt with by the Almighty God. So that David basically says, my God will deliver me from this giant today. But then my mind goes back to the time where Jesus is walking on the water. Storm, disciples are in the boat. Jesus is about ready to walk by them, which is interesting. And Peter says, hey, it's Jesus. Hey, Jesus, can I come out? He said, come on, water's fine. And so Peter hops overboard and he starts to walk to him. But the waves start splashing and the wind is blowing against him. And in the midst of that moment, Peter takes his eyes off Jesus and he begins to sink. He starts to look at all of the storms surrounding him, and he takes his eyes off the Lord. And I think that the heart of this battle for God's people is to say, don't look at the enemy, look at your deliverer. I know your enemy seems big to you, but I am bigger still. So we have fright, flight, sight, and finally here we have fight. And Moses tells the people of God, the Lord will fight for you. In other words, this is God's fight because he is a warrior God. In Exodus 15, just the next chapter, verse 3, they sing a song, the song of Moses, as a praise to God. And I love this verse. It says, "The Lord is a warrior, the Lord is his name." I have taken in the last couple of years that particular verse as a prayer. And I'll often, sometimes in the morning, turn to God and say, "God, you are a warrior God. Please fight on my behalf. And give me your heart, the heart of a warrior, that I could fight on your behalf, that I could fight faithfully for you." God is bigger than the enemy. God is bigger than the battle. I'll take a look at the set of lines underneath that. The question then is, does this mean that God never asks us to battle or take action? So he's always going to fight and I just kind of sit passively? I just want to say no, because there are times that it's exactly what he calls us to do. He said, it's time to fight. But even then, and this is the important part, the power to overcome is his. The glory is his, not ours. And then the final word there is quiet. Now, I know it's not exactly but it's close, it. So we're going from fright to flight to sight to fight, and then quiet. And he says, be still. Be still. In other words, another way of saying is be quiet and watch while I take care of this. It's not necessarily a call to meditation. Sometimes be still and know that I'm God. And some of us take that as a way of just literally being quiet and reflecting on God. And I think, there's power to that. But it's also a matter of just saying, of not be busy trying to figure this out and fix it. God is saying, I've got this. So my question for you is, how are you at being quiet and trusting your fears to God, at remembering who is God? When the storms are coming around you, isn't it easy to take our eyes off of God? I want to tell you a story about a missionary. Her name is Gladys Allward. She was a missionary to China in a time of turmoil, and Japan, when they were a powerful nation, had come in and had invaded parts of China, and they were invading the area at Yancheng where she had a work with children, and she didn't want to give that work up and leave the children behind, and so she made a pilgrimage from there over the mountains toward free areas of China. And in their book, The Hidden Price of Greatness, Ray Besson and Rendella Mack Hunsaker tell what happened. They said, during Gladys's harrowing journey out of war-torn Yancheng, she grappled with despair as never before. She was overwhelmed. After passing a sleepless night, she faced the morning with no hope of reaching safety. She didn't think they were going to make it. But then a 13-year-old girl in the group reminded her of their much-loved story of Moses and the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. "But I'm not Moses," Gladys cried in desperation. And to which the little girl responded, "Of course you aren't. But Jehovah is still God. But Yahweh is still God." Isn't it really easy to read some of the stories of the people of great faith in the Old Testament and say, yeah, well, that's Moses, or that's Paul, or that's Peter, or that's Elijah, or that's Jesus. And the point the little girl made is exactly the point that the Scripture wants to make is, it's not about Moses, it's not about Peter, it's not about Elijah. It's about the God behind all of that is still able today to do what needs to be done. That God is still God. And he's bigger than our battles. Well, let's go to the tail end of this insert in the message this morning. What's the ultimate goal of this battle? There's a battle going on. The people of God are kind of watching it. And I want to highlight a few things. The first thing is this, that our deliverance is not the ultimate goal. The deliverance of God's people is not the ultimate goal of that. Now, don't get me wrong, God wanted to deliver them. That was a key point. And he wants to deliver us too. But that's not the ultimate goal. Secondly, our sense of pride or confidence is not the ultimate goal. Now, I can only imagine the people of God felt much more confident afterwards, going, hey, our God's he's pretty good. And Moses, not a bad leader. And so, at least for those moments, they are filling and developing some faith. So that's a good thing. But those aren't the ultimate goals. You know what the ultimate goal is? The ultimate goal is the glory of God. The ultimate goal is His glory. In fact, what's fascinating is one of the words that's used for the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is the same root word that is also used for glorifying and honor God. In other words, in the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, God would be glorified. That in the destruction of Egypt's army, God would be glorified. In the deliverance of God's people, God would be glorified. In fact, this is a goal that will be met by Israel singing His praises. In fact, guess what happens in chapter 15? They're literally singing praises. Do you remember what Moses was told by God when he's first being called at the burning bush, and God says, here's the first sign for you. When you get out of Egypt, you will worship me. The people of God will worship me at this mountain. In other words, the people of God were set free to worship. And so one of the ways in which God's goal is realized is in the songs and the stories of deliverance of His people. Because in doing this, Egypt and Israel and all nations will know that there's one true God. In fact, that's God's goal for us too. Is that as He delivers us, He wants us to be the proclaimers of that same message to a world that needs to know there's hope in the midst of darkness. That there's a God that delivers, that there's a promised land. I've seen it, so to speak, and you want to go there because this is the God who delivers. But let me pause here for a second. Does it bother you that God's ultimate goal is His own glory? I mean, do you find yourself going, oh, now wait a second, that seems kind of self-centered, doesn't it? I mean, is God so insecure that He has to have us standing around Him praising Him? I know some of you are going, can you say that out loud? But I think that there are some people that really wrestle with that. That just seems, we shouldn't do that. Well, here's the point. You and I shouldn't do that. Because if you and I centered something around ourselves and asked people to bow down to us, we would be proclaiming that we're God, and that is clearly wrong. But what about if you are God? And you are the creator of all the universe, and you are infinite, and you are all-powerful. It is not only appropriate, it makes complete sense. Because all these people are bowing down to false gods, and God is trying to make clear, we need to get first things first. There's only one God, and it's me. And once you get that straight, then you'll know where you come from, you'll know when things get wrong, and you'll know where you're headed. But as soon as something else or somebody else becomes God, your world will get turned upside down. So once we establish this, the rest of it flows from that. No wonder God's people are called to be a worshiping people. No wonder we sing songs of deliverance, because that's our history. Let's take a look at that last set of lines. You see, the Exodus will become the primary story of God's deliverance for His people, and it will shape and it will mark them all the way up to the coming of Jesus. In fact, even the children of these people, the descendants of these people, will eventually, on a yearly basis, remember the Passover. And they'll reenact, they will live out the deliverance. In fact, they're supposed to do it with a meal and everything else that evening as if they are being delivered all over again. In other words, the deliverance of God's people hundreds of years before is now my story, and I'm part of it. By the way, that's what we do at communion too. You see, when Jesus instituted communion, guess what meal it was? It was a Passover. It was a celebration of this very story. And Jesus very clearly says, I'm the point of the story. You're looking for a deliverer, I'm the deliverer. You're looking for forgiveness of sins, I am the lamb whose blood will be shed. You're looking for one who will come as a king, I am that king. I am. And so when we come to communion, it's a story of our deliverance. And so here's my question for you. Did you know that you too are meant to have a story of deliverance? What's your story? And are you telling anybody? I just want to say, you don't have to have been delivered from literal slavery to have a story. Because maybe your story is a story of freedom from addiction. Or maybe your story is of freedom from a sinful lifestyle that's been destroying you. Or from bitterness or anger or healing from years of abuse and woundedness that goes way back. But I also want to say, you don't have to have been an addict or to have been abused to have a story of deliverance. You don't have to have ever even left the church. Maybe you grew up in the church and you never lived a horrible lifestyle. And so your freedom story might be freedom from pride and freedom from arrogance or going through the motions, or maybe freedom from legalism and perfectionism, and finally into the promised land of grace. We all have a story of deliverance. Yours might look different than mine. But in order for us to be part of the people of God, we all have to go through the wilderness, through the Red Sea. We all have to be delivered in order to find the promised land. What's your story? This morning, maybe you don't have that story. I mean, maybe you've never stepped across that line. I want to let you know I'm going to be, after the service, I'll be over in the room next to us. I'd love to talk to you about what that looks like so that you could have your own story as well. But this morning, as we come to communion, we're declaring that story of deliverance all over again. And so I want to invite you, if you're a Christian, you don't have to be a member here. You're welcome to partake with us. After I pray, you can just go to one of the tables where the trays are and get those communion cups, and then come back to your seat and just spend some time with Jesus. Let's pray. Jesus, as we come to you now, you are the author of this story of deliverance. But you're also the primary actor. And you entered the story. And so we thank you. Each time we get to tell the story, I pray that we will be more confident about the truth of that story in ourselves, and confident that we can tell that story to others, that more and more people will come to have their own story as well. I pray in your name. Amen.